Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu den Vision Awards 20. Hello and a very warm welcome to the Vision Awards 20. So we have some music. I don't know where this music is coming from. Thank you. Das ist eine Live-Sendung, wie man sieht. So we had some little problems to find our keynote speaker in the United States. So that's the reason I'm talking in English now. We found him and he is right with us in a very few seconds. So let me introduce the show tonight, and we are doing the first hour in English and the second hour with a celebration of the Vision Awards 20 in German. Today Pascal Finette will speak about disruption, dystopia and decisions. Questions are welcome. Please simply enter the YouTube chat channel and during the presentation, and we talk and discuss later. Pascal, herzlich willkommen bei den Vision Awards.
Thank you so much, and I'm super excited to be here with you today. And let's not lose any time, and let me get into my presentation here. And welcome. I want to talk to you a little bit about the future and give you probably a couple of very practical frameworks to make sense of this interesting new world we're living in. And here's the most important thing I can tell you about the future. And if you're forgetting everything I'm going to talk to you about in the next 30-ish minutes, please keep this in mind, that tomorrow will look dramatically different than today. And the funny thing is, I've been saying this for the last, I don't know, like 5 years or so. And, you know, like people, like they nod and, you know, are nice. But I don't think really everybody has understood this. But I believe clearly what COVID has taught us, amongst many other things, is that this is true beyond belief. Now, we used to live in a world where you might be familiar with the three time horizon concept. So McKinsey has the time horizon 1, 2, 3. Our friends at EY have this idea around, or the notion around, the now, the next, and the beyond. So as a leader, regardless if you're a business leader or a social leader, you really think about, like, there's the now, what are you doing today? There's the next, which was it's around the corner, the 2 years out. And then there was the beyond. And the beyond was always the 5-year, 10-year future. And if you take away all the human tragedy and, of course, economic tragedy that COVID has brought to the world, there's something really interesting what it also does. It has accelerated our time horizons. So what used to be the now and the next, two distinct time horizons, has collapsed into a single point in time, the now and the next, which happens right here, right now. And then what used to be 5 years out or 10 years out in the future is now truly the question of what happens beyond COVID. So really the question about 2021, 2022. Another way to look at this is technology moves on these exponentially accelerating curves. We talk about this in a minute a little bit better and more, but adoption tends to lag. Adoption is a little slower in its quality. And what we're seeing with COVID is what we call the COVID-19 bump. Technology has changed, and the adoption of technology has changed dramatically. In some cases, some people argue it has brought technology forward by 5 to 10 years. A good example is the fact that we're doing this here over video instead of, us being in a beautiful building and doing it in person. Now, with that being said, everything you need to know, we can summarize in a single slide. And of course, it's the exponential curve. Now, I want to do a couple things here. One is, if someone tells you technology moves on an exponential curve, it's an approximation. Of course, it doesn't be an exponential curve forever. These trends tend to flatten out at one point. So keep this in mind. It is a useful framework and an approximation. And a good example of this for this is, of course, as we all know, computers, right? Like computers get twice as fast every 2 years. That's a good example for an exponential trend. Also one which is flattening out a little bit, but we'll see that in a minute. More importantly, and this is where I get interested, I'd say, about the future, is this. If you're standing somewhere where this gentleman stands and you're looking to the past, and the past is often the only thing we know, the only reference point we have. If you look at the past looks flat and linear. If you have the ability, and this is what we're going to talk about today, if you have the ability to see the future as this weird character, it looks strange and wild and steep. Ernest Hemingway wrote a book called The Sun Also Rises. In this book, he has a quote which we have stolen and misappropriated, but it's a beautiful quote. And we now call this the Hemingway Law of Motion. And the Hemingway Law of Motion says gradually and then suddenly. And that's what happens to these trends. So keep this in mind. It's like it feels for a long time nothing happens, and then suddenly they seem to pop into existence. Now, I want to show you a second slide because I think this one is actually much more important. And so the summarization of this slide is something called Wright's Law. Theodore Wright in 1936, by observing the airline manufacturing industry, so airplane manufacturing industry, said and observed that our progress increases with experience. A different way to express this is this. For every percentage increase in production, we increase our productivity at a fixed rate. What this means in very simple layman's terms, the more you make of something, the better we get. And the better we get at something, the cheaper it gets. And the cheaper it gets, the more people will buy it. So we make more, and you see how this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. What Amazon calls the flywheel effect. Once you start this, it starts to spin faster and faster and faster. Here's a good example for this. This is the cost per kilowatt hour for lithium-ion batteries. And as you can see, from 1995 to about 2005, the cost has come down dramatically, truly exponential decline in cost. For the simple reason, lithium-ion batteries are the batteries in your laptop and your phones, etc. And we just made more of those because, as they became more available, we made more, and then prices came down, so we made more. But then by 2005, the price flattened out. It's kind of like stagnated. Until 2012, Tesla introduced the Model S. The Model S electric vehicle has the equivalent of about 9,000 iPhone batteries in it. And then we see, again, the dramatic drop in price performance. So that is to say, as you're looking at what we're going to do now, as we're looking at the future, think about even if something might be too expensive today, as customers find the product or the service, it gets cheaper because they're using it more and we get better at it. So keep that in mind. It's a very important law. MIT has run this law through its gamut and has looked at 40 plus different major breakthrough innovations, anything from, of course, the airplane to cars to broadband internet to the computer itself, and found that Wright's law keeps up for all of those. So here's an interesting question, and one you can ask yourself. So what you're seeing here is the time we spent with digital media. The red bars is mobile phones, blue is desktop and laptops, white is other internet connected devices. On the red side, the mobile side, clearly exponential growth. We don't need to talk about this. This is 2008 to 2018. But here's an interesting question, and you can do this at home right now. Imagine I could only show you the graph for 2008. Would you have said, looking just at the data, not taking into account what else you might know, but would you have said in 2008 that mobile is going to change the world? Most of us wouldn't. And then you can ask yourself, looking at those graphs, when would be the point where you say mobile is going to change the world? And realistically, for most of us, and we've done this literally hundreds of times with executives all over the world, the median, the number one named answer is 2012. It kind of makes sense, right? Because 2012 is where mobile became about a fourth to a third of overall media consumption. So you could feel it. But here's the interesting point. When you look at when some of the most interesting companies were born, which leverage mobile at their very core, it becomes really interesting. 2008 is Airbnb, Uber 2009, WhatsApp 2009, Instagram 2010, and the list goes on and on and on. So that is to say, we would have missed these companies not by 3 months or 6 months. We would have missed them by 2 years. So we need to get really good at reading these early stages of the exponential trend, something we call, or this futurist community actually calls, weak signals. So let's look at a couple of those weak signals and let's see how they develop. And we're going to start with compute because it's kind of like the mother of all exponential trends, of course. And just to give you a sense of how far we have come, what you see here is the Apollo 11 guidance computer. That computer's purpose was fly man most of the way to the moon, land man on the moon, take off from the moon, and fly us all the way back to Earth. The computer had 1 megahertz clock speed, 4 kilobytes of RAM, and 72 kilobytes of ROM. If you open a Word document, just to say, if you open a Word document today, you don't do anything, you just save it, empty. It's already bigger than what this computer could even process. Now contrast this with today. This is a USB-C charger. It comes free with your iPhone or your laptop. In this charger is a chip. That chip's purpose is to charge your phone. Truly, there's absolutely no other purpose of that chip, just charge your phone. That chip has a 40 megahertz clock speed, 8 kilobytes of RAM, 128 kilobytes of ROM. It's 48 times as fast, 2 times more memory, and 70% more code than the computer which flew us to the moon, which I think has proven once and for all that we never went to the moon. But joking aside, here's where it becomes interesting. As we're moving from these epochs, we used to have mainframes in the 50s, and then we made the computers smaller and they became mini computers. And then we built personal computers in the 80s, and then we made those smaller and they became mobile phones. And then eventually we moved them all into the cloud. So computing isn't even there anymore, visibly. We're now doing something called edge computing. We make computers so small, so powerful that we put them at the very edges of the network. Some people call this fog computing, as of course a reference to cloud. My friend Alan Brock calls this ambient computing because it truly becomes ambient. It's just there. And here's where it gets interesting. This is a $150 home video camera. It's a security camera. Comes out of the house of Google. What this camera does is it has an interesting trick up its sleeves. It does facial recognition. So you train it on your face, the face of your spouse, the face of your children, the face of your dog. And when any one of those walks through its field of vision, the camera doesn't do anything because it knows it's you. But when it sees someone who isn't you, it sends you an alert. Now here's where it gets interesting. All of this compute, the training of the AI model, the facial recognition, all of the work being done there is done on the camera on a chip which costs less than $2. And that is an interesting weak signal because I'm asking myself, if you can do this on this camera, what else could you do? Where else could you use this? And think about, for example, manufacturing. If you had a $2 chip which can look at defects in your manufacturing with a tiny lens, how much better could you make manufacturing? So what you want to do when you look at weak signals is the transfer from one industry to the other. And also you want to ask yourself, what are the implications of the implication, the further edges of what those implications could look like? Here's a good example, AI and algorithms, just to round this out. This is data which comes from OpenAI, is a research institute out of Silicon Valley. They looked at the computational throughput of AI networks from 2012 to the end of 2018. And what they found is that they have truly exploded in their capacity, truly exponential growth. In those 7 years, AI has become 300,000 times as good and is currently doubling every 270 days. Which is an interesting question because when you look at AI today, you might say AI isn't good enough. And my answer to that is, well, not today, but probably in the future. Here's another one. This is a super early, pretty weird weak signal, quantum computing. Quantum computing is based on quantum mechanics, a very different way to look at the worlds of physics. A normal computer, the computer you use today, the computer you use to watch this keynote, can only see zeros and ones, energy on and energy off, electricity. On this globe, it can only see the top and the bottom, the north and the south pole, because it can only see ones and zeros. A quantum computer, and this is a gross oversimplification, of course, but a quantum computer can see every single dot on the outer sphere of this globe at the same time. And that makes quantum computers really good at simulations. And in the world of quantum computing is a thing called quantum supremacy, which is the moment when you have a quantum computer which is better at solving a problem than a normal computer, and vastly better. And if you would have asked me 5 years ago, when do I think this will happen? I would have told you probably 10 years from now. And what happened is at the end of last year, 2019, Google published a peer-reviewed paper in Nature where they showed that their quantum computer could solve a problem which takes a normal computer 10,000 years in less than 200 seconds. And if you want to play with a quantum computer today, you don't need to invest tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. You can literally go to Microsoft Azure and rent one in the cloud. Or you can go to Amazon if that is your cup of tea. Or soon you can go to Google and rent theirs. And here's where it gets interesting. This is a game I loved to play when I was a kid, SimCity. And if you know anything about SimCity, it looks a lot like this. SimCity is a pretty complex city simulation where you build a city and you've got all these interactions between the people who live and work there in this virtual city. Highly complex simulation. Now here's the future of business, maybe, which is when you have a quantum computer, you could take all the inputs of your company, all your cost structure, your revenues, your marketing data, your sales data, all the vital signs of your company, and you put that into a quantum computer. And then you let the quantum computer essentially run this as a simulation. Remember, quantum computers are incredibly good at simulations. And then the quantum computer will determine the best possible path forward. And that leads us into a world where the question becomes, what is the role of the C-suite when a quantum computer just can determine the best possible path for your company? It's a really fascinating world. Now, again, we see these weak signals everywhere. So the moment you start opening up your eyes towards the future, you see them. This is out of a magazine in the utility and electricity space. Qatar set up a 800 megawatt solar-powered facility at the beginning of this year and received bids for it without any subsidies, fully amortized over the typical run rate of a solar facility, somewhere around 20 to 30 years, for less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour. The cheapest form of energy today is typically coal or gas. And when you build coal or gas plants, they're typically about twice as much. So we're getting into a world where renewable energy will become so cheap that we might give it away nearly for free. It's a crazy world. Genetic engineering, we've seen the price of sequencing a human genome drop from $2 billion for a single genome over just a 20-year period to less than $1,000 today. And then when you ask experts, and you say, where is this going? They will tell you that it's going to be another order of magnitude cheaper in the next 5 years. So you will sequence a genome in about 5 years for probably $100 or less, which is really interesting because think about what this means for the world of healthcare, for example. And then COVID opens up a whole new world of new weak signals. Remote work. Of course, we lived in a world where there was remote work before, but now we're in a world where there's 100% remote work. Travel. We don't travel anymore, or our travel pattern have changed pretty dramatically. The world of education is changing and has changed dramatically. If you have kids at home, you know this, you know very well what I'm talking about. The world of fashion has changed. A good friend of mine is a tailor. He makes beautiful bespoke suits. He hasn't sold a single suit since March because we don't wear suits anymore. I've got other friends who are in the leisure wear fashion category. They can't manufacture sweatpants fast enough, because that seems to be everything we're wearing these days. So we're seeing these weak signals everywhere. And again, I want to teach you a little trick, which is this idea that when you look at a weak signal, you want to ask the question, what does this point to, and how could you apply it into a different industry, but also what are the implications of the implication? Here's a good example. Food delivery. Of course, food delivery existed before COVID, but since COVID, food delivery has truly exploded. So much so that Amazon in the US needed to hire nearly 200,000 new people just to keep up with demand for food delivery. But here's a fascinating question. In the world of food delivery, the products you're buying, they're optimized for shelf space. They're optimized so that you walk through a supermarket and you see one of these bottles and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. I want to have this bottle. It's beautiful. But those bottles aren't optimized for shipping. And I think that one of the implications of our move towards more food delivery is that we will see companies grow who build products which are optimized in their packaging for shipping in a food delivery world. And we already see the early signals of that. Now, I want to conclude this part by talking about how do you actually take a weak signal, because you should always ask the question, not every weak signal turns into a strong signal. Not every weak signal will actually become a thing. So the question then becomes, how do you find out what susses or what differentiates a weak from a strong signal? And we have a framework for this. And it starts here. Again, technology, the red line, your expectation. The expectation, your expectation, is the blue line. We tend to overestimate technology in the beginning. We get super excited about it. I remember I used to work at Google when we released Google Glass. And Google Glass, I was so excited to wear Google Glass, and I was wearing it at the Google campus. And then, like 30 minutes into wearing it, I was like, oh my God, this is the worst product ever. So you get super disappointed. But then technology gets better, it matures. And you get to the moment when Steve Jobs in 2007 shows you the iPhone for the first time, and you realize, wow, man, phones aren't phones anymore, phones are computers. And then you get into this world where the changes become so fast, so vast, that you can't keep up with them, something we call chaos and amazement. So the way to look at this, another way to look at this is Gartner has, the Market Research Institute, Gartner has a thing called the Gartner Hype Cycle, which they publish for decades now. And they map every technology on this expectation line. So they say, where is a particular technology? So you can actually look up, where are we here? But the important thing is this. It takes years and sometimes decades for technologies to mature. That's important to understand because very often we tend to jump onto technology too early. Again, Google Glass is a very good example for this. So get your timing right. Figure out, what does the technology actually need to look like? What needs to be true for the technology to be really, truly disruptive? A good example at the moment is the blockchain, which I would argue is still not at the point where it is really taking over. But here's the important insight. Once these lines are crossing, you only have 6 to 18 months because these markets are being made super, super quickly. So you need to educate yourself and build muscle memory over time so that you're ready for the moment when the lines are crossing, because otherwise you're too late. And then I heavily encourage you to look at something. There's a beautiful German word, Gestalt. And I absolutely love this word because what you have to do is you need to look at the holistic view of what makes a technology pop. What is the stuff which needs to be true or needs to be removed for a technology to be successful outside of the technology itself? Here's a good example and the way you can look at this. The futurist community has a framework called STEEPS, or an acronym. STEEP stands for what are the other scientific and technological breakthroughs, the environmental and economic breakthroughs, and the political and social breakthroughs for a technology to become successful. A good example is if you think about streaming, video streaming. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to do if you are Netflix or your YouTube or anyone else on your end. But also, you need to look at what is the broadband internet penetration of your target audience look like. Because if they don't have broadband internet penetration high enough, you can do whatever you want, it will never take off. So it's really important, and I get entrepreneurs often forget this. They get so enamored by their core technology that they don't look at the Gestalt. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, you need to educate yourself alongside this curve. We call this the applied knowledge principle. So 2 factors. You need to get your timing right, and you need to look at the Gestalt for a weak signal to become a strong signal. But there's a second component to this, which is the problem space itself. And when you look at your problem, the problem you want to solve, you want to ask yourself a couple questions. What is the frequency of the problem? What is the density? And what is the friction of the problem? How often do you encounter the problem? How much time do you spend in the problem? And how much friction does the problem cause you? Because if those factors are too low, you might have a solution, but you don't have a problem. So we look at this essentially as this canvas where we say, what is the timing? And the question you want to ask yourself, is the solution available and scalable? And how fit and mature are the tech and the tools? You look at the Gestalt. What else needs to be true? And use the STEEPS framework here. And then you look at the frequency. How often do we encounter the problem? How long and deep is your engagement with the problem on the density side? And on the friction side, you want to ask, how much pain do you actually experience with the problem? Again, if frequency, density, and friction isn't high enough, you don't actually solve a problem. Let me end all of this here with a last example. And I want to talk about this notion about gradually and then suddenly. And this is an example where I personally get super excited, and my team knows this really well. I'm pretty obsessed about this. But here's an interesting case. This here is a good friend of ours. This is a young lady called Michaela Sousa. Michaela is an Instagram influencer. So Michaela travels the world, appears on Instagram, has 2.5 million followers on Instagram. And Michaela makes her money by having sponsorship deals, your classic Instagram influencer story. Michaela has a super cute boyfriend who travels with her. She hangs out with really interesting people. So these two elderly, the gentleman and the lady, they're some of the most important New York-based art collectors. So she has good friends in high places. So again, this is your classic Michaela Instagram influencer story, 2.5 million followers. But here's a fascinating thing about Michaela. Michaela is not real. Michaela is a computer avatar. She's a computer rendering. And here's the thing which I find fascinating about our friend Michaela. Michaela can travel wherever she wants. Michaela will never get COVID. Michaela works 24/7. Michaela doesn't have an attitude. Michaela does whatever you want her to do, which is really fascinating because Michaela, again, becomes an interesting weak signal, of course, for the fashion industry. If you're a supermodel, I would really think about what does the future of a supermodel look like? But Michaela is also an interesting weak signal for other things in the world. This guy here is Roy Orbison. Roy is a American musician. Roy is dead, but you can see Roy today perform live in concert in front of thousands of people with a live band as a three-dimensional high-resolution hologram. Now, this Roy Orbison is really interesting. I've got friends in the entertainment business, and they get super excited about this Roy Orbison because this Roy Orbison can perform in 10 venues on the same day at the same time. This Roy Orbison also doesn't need to fly around in a first-class private jet. That Roy Orbison just gets into a little box. And that Roy Orbison also will never ever ask to remove the brown M&Ms in his backstage. So again, ask yourself, what are these interesting weak signals look like in the future? And I want to close us out on a quote. This is a dear friend of ours, Ron Shake. Ron is the founder of Panera Bread, which is a very successful, healthy fast food chain in the US. And I asked Ron a while ago, how did you do this? And he said something truly impressive to me. He said, our approach has always been to discover today what will matter tomorrow, and then to transform our company into a future that is unfolding before us. And I think that's what we have to do as leaders today. Like in this world we're living is, we really need to spend time to figure out what matters tomorrow, and then transform our companies, our societies, our families into that future which we are now seeing in front of us. That is all I had for you today. As a very quick note, we have our own version of Michaela, and you can just email this email address, hello@beradical.xyz. You get my personal contact details, my LinkedIn, etc. And we also share all our research in a private network, so we'll invite you into that network as well. So that being said, I will close out my screen share, and I'm just super curious what it is you have to share with me and your questions.
Pascal, thank you very much for this inspiring keynote. We got some questions. I have to look it up because I just got all these sheet of papers. First, just one question. What's about Be Radical? What are you doing with this company?
Yes, so Be Radical is a boutique advisory firm. What we're doing is we help organizations, typically in Germany you call them Mittelstand, like medium-sized organizations, and we help them basically inspire their leadership and the middle management. We educate them and empower them to create the future they want to create. So we work a lot with these companies on their future. That's probably the easiest way to explain it.
Great. And you also founded or co-founded a university. So what is it about? Where is it? Singularity University.
So Singularity University is, and I'm not the co-founder, so just so we're clear, I'm the chair for entrepreneurship there.
I see.
But Singularity University is based in Silicon Valley. It's a mixture between a think tank about the future and an executive education institution. So what we're doing at Singularity is we're trying to figure out what the future could look like, and really looking at the further out future, 10 plus years. And then we bring this back and educate executives all around the world on what that future could look like, and how do you prepare for that future, and how do you create the future? Because the beauty of the future is it is unwritten, right? There is no definition on a future. It's not there yet. It's on us to create it.
Let me use the terms of Steve Jobs, because you just mentioned the future, the next 10 years. What do you think is the next big thing for us in the next decade?
That's a really good question. If I had a wish, I wish we would all wake up to the fact that we're living in a world which is being disrupted in very negative terms. If you look at particularly the problems around climate change, I think that's the most pressing, most severe threat to humanity at a very large scale. And I hope that we and the entrepreneurs out there and the big corporations also wake up to it and tackle this problem and see it as what it is, a big problem which needs to be solved. So I think that climate change will be, if we like it or not, but it will be a very strong current through everything we're going to do over the next 10 years, 20 years.
Yeah, right now you have got a lot of fires in the United States, but do you think there is now the situation that even in the United States there is a change in the minds? In Europe, I think it's a bit different to USA.
Yeah. Oh my God, yes. It's a good question. I've got days where I think we're on the right path and we can actually tackle this, and then have days when I open Twitter and see yet another tweet from my president, and probably think a little differently about like what our engagement on this level is. The problem with the climate change debate is, I think, and that makes it so hard, of course, is that it's not something a single country can solve, nor is it a single thing we need to do. If you think back to the ozone layer problem, there was a single thing. It was a single gas we needed to get rid of, essentially. Climate change is so much more multifaceted. So I think it really requires a rethinking and from a systems design perspective. And I do hope that we all can come together and actually tackle it, because it's important.
Yeah. I think the solar companies, wind energy, now it's changing a little bit. In Europe, perhaps more than somewhere else. What else could, for instance, the companies in the Silicon Valley do that it's becoming better?
Yeah, I think it's the culmination of so many things. I think there's so many sectors and which need to be rethought. But also, I think that opens up really interesting opportunities, which is where I would invite people to think about. This is not just about risk mitigation or risk solving. It's also about creating new opportunities. So a good example for me is if you think about our reliance on meat production for protein, for example, which clearly has massive impacts on the planet in terms of climate, like cutting down the rainforests, etc. And then you see what happens with the alternative meat companies, Memphis Meat, Impossible, Beyond Meat, etc. They've become massive and super quickly, very, very big. Or you look at electric vehicles, so getting away from combustion engines, and you see what has happened with Tesla. So my invitation is always look at those problem fields, but turn them on their head, because very often there's an interesting opportunity emerging out of them. And instead of looking at the world through a lens of how do we mitigate or solve the problem, really think about how can we solve the problem by creating something new. And I think that's where I get excited. And of course, these awards are all about, people going out there, tackling these hard problems and solving for them.
You were talking about artificial intelligence, which is more or less facing to all the branches. What is perhaps the most influence now with artificial intelligence to several branches? What do you think will change faster?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's a lot of hype, of course, in artificial intelligence. If you've seen the latest announcements around, there's a technology tool called GPT-3, which is it ingests a lot of text and then creates new text based on very few keywords. So if you want to write an article, for example, you can basically just say, here's for a soccer match, like here's the score, here's like who did the scores, and then it writes the whole article, which points towards an interesting future where we probably don't have journalists writing those articles anymore. But that doesn't mean that the AI actually even understand what it is writing about. So I think it's really important to understand that AI is like eons away from actually really understanding something. So the way I look at AI is a really powerful tool if it's used in combination with human ingenuity, like the thing we are really good at, which is reasoning. So I think the really interesting opportunities for AI is to apply it to areas where we have good data sets, where we generate a lot of data, and then have it combine it with the brilliance of the human mind, which brings reasoning to the analysis. And if you think about that, there's a ton of areas where you can do this. Anything from automation to like the financial industry, of course, where you get lots of data, to even climate change, where we start to get lots of data and like can probably use AI to come up with interesting solutions towards those.
You were talking about blockchain too. In Germany, we are, I think most people are quite far away from using blockchain technology. How much will that affect us the next years?
Yeah, blockchain is my little. So I will get slaughtered now, but I think blockchain for me, blockchain is my little like pet peeve is probably the right word. I think there's a couple use cases for blockchain, particularly in the space of cryptocurrencies, where it originally came from, right? The blockchain was the underlying technology of Bitcoin, of course, which was the first emergence of the blockchain. The blockchain is a little bit of a technology solution in search of a problem. I'm not super bullish on most of the blockchain cases you see today. So there's a lot of talk about using the blockchain for the supply chain, or using the blockchain to do land registry, where you register all your like properties and houses and so on. And the question for me always comes, why wouldn't you just do this in a database, which is much easier, much cheaper, easier to scale, has a much better understood technology, etc. And the realistic answer is most of the cases a database, like a database powered system, would do the exact same thing and probably better and cheaper and quicker. So again, I'm not super bullish on the blockchain. I think there's use cases in specific niches where the blockchain will shine. But I think it's a little overhyped, to be very frank and honest. But again, like I know that like there's a bunch of people who will kill me now, which is fine.
And blockchain needs a lot of energy, for sure.
Yes, at least the current iterations, most of the current iterations, if you want to do it right, has a very significant impact on resource usage, for sure, which is also one of the problems you have with the technology.
Last question, I have to look it up. It's a bit more special. How do you differentiate linear from non-linear dynamics? The weak signal that turns into exponential curve and from butterfly effect.
Yes, that's a super interesting question, and very, very observant, because when you look at the early stages of an exponential trend, it nearly looks linear, right? It doesn't really look that much different to a linear trend. I think your best bet is applying the strong signal filters I just briefly mentioned and showed you to really suss out what is the overarching staying power of that signal, and how much of that can actually be explode. That's one. The second one is, we talked briefly about Wright's law at the beginning. Not every technology, not everything falls under Wright's law. So I would also figure out, do you believe that whatever technology you're looking at might fall under Wright's law, meaning that the more you make of it, the cheaper it will get. And if that is the case, then you have a flywheel, an underlying flywheel, which can actually get you to to exponential growth versus just linear growth.
Pascal, thank you so much for the discussion. If you like, join us for the celebration and the presentation of the Vision Awards. Ich möchte mich ganz herzlich bedanken, einmal bei Stefan Suter und dem Mediennetzwerk Bayern, ohne die die Sendung so einfach nicht hätte stattfinden können. Das Mediennetzwerk Bayern ist seit Ewigkeiten jetzt schon unser Partner. Herzlichen Dank auch an meine Jury mit vielen, vielen Mitgliedern, die in diesem Jahr waren wir zu 16 dabei und haben viel diskutiert. Wir haben viel Research gemacht. Jedes Mitglied hat eigene Vorschläge gemacht. Ich bedanke mich natürlich ganz, ganz herzlich auch an Pascal Finette, der mit seiner Keynote uns doch für viele Dinge und viel inspiriert hat heute. Und ich danke auch hier dem ganzen Team im Studio von Boa Videofilmkunst. Wir haben das erste Mal, glaube ich, zusammengearbeitet. Das muss ungefähr 15 Jahre her sein und die Gesichter sind immer noch dieselben. Eine Spur älter vielleicht, aber bei meiner allerersten Live-Sendung vor Ewigkeiten waren wir auch fast dasselbe Team. Es hat heute technisch ganz gut funktioniert und dafür danke, dass unser Keynote-Speaker irgendwie auf dem Weg zwischen Amerika und hier die ersten Minuten verschollen war. Dafür konnten wir natürlich nichts, aber es hat alles wunderbar geklappt. Ich freue mich, wenn wir uns bei einer unserer Vision Award Veranstaltungen zwischen den großen Veranstaltungen wiedersehen. Wir nennen das Visionen After Work. Da gibt es dann kurze Vorträge, inspirierende Vorträge, so in der Richtung, wie es jetzt Pascal Finette gemacht hat oder wie es davor Joby Benjamin gemacht hat. Kommen Sie dazu und ich würde mich freuen, euch alle wiederzusehen, spätestens natürlich in einem Jahr bei den Vision Awards 21. Herzlichen Dank und noch einen schönen Abend.